Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, those of you here and also those of us joining us via internet. We start today the third cycle within the project titled Democracy and Tolerance, coordinated, inspired, and promoted by Fernando Vallespín, which has a lot to do with the reasons why this Institución Libre de Enseñanza was founded in 1876 and the concerns that their creators had until 1936 and then later during the years of exile. Giner passed away in February. And he was very much concerned by the outbreak of the First World War, which left him very concerned. Giner had been educated in Germany, even though many of his references, his models, could be found in the UK and in the Anglo-Saxon world in general. In his opinion, this really represented the failure of the old Europe, and he was really well informed about the atrocities of the conflict. Right after this World War, a movement started all over the world to reflect on the war and the future of culture, which was structured in many different ways. One of the most relevant ones was the creation of the intellectual group of the United Nations. Several meetings were held, one of them chaired by Marie Curie, right before the Second World War broke out. Fortunately, the circumstances today are quite different to those back then, but the democracy seems to be threatened in its tenets of tolerance, the education of self-governing citizens, and we found the same concerns that we found at the time when the institution was established. For instance, we held a seminar on the Krausist movement, and the Krausists thought that the planet had its own rights, not only the different animal species, but the planet itself. And the Krausists were especially concerned about the responsibility we had vis-a-vis the future generations. This is a problem that we will be discussing during this cycle of conferences, as well as inequality. That will be another of the topics. Well, of course, all of this has led us to create a working space with the aim to create a working group, international working group, to reflect upon those issues. And after 3 years of work, I think that we can say that we have made our small contribution to the creation of the critical mass that is necessary to face the very uncertain future that we face. I would like to thank Fernando Vallespín for his generosity, his enthusiasm, And that's all. So I'm going to give the floor to Fernando. Thank you very much, Pepe, for trusting me to continue to manage this project, and I would like to thank you all for your attendance. The subject of my presentation today is quite extensive. I have tried to summarize it and to be as specific and as synthetic as possible. I'm going to try to speak a little bit fast to give some time to for questions at the Q&A. The title of this cycle is Democracy Facing the New Risks, How to Invest in Resilience. I have chosen a different title. Between the present and the future, the new risks that democracy faces. Of course, we are going to deal with them. One of the biggest challenges, climate change, and new geopolitics, the restructuring of globalization, what is going on with technology, not only artificial intelligence, but the possibility of citizens being monitored by the internet, the problem of inequality, and of course, from the point of view of the threats that these risks pose to liberal democracy. So, in as far as we have a functioning democracy, fully cohesive, the greater will our capability be to face these challenges efficiently. That's why I've chosen the title Between the Present and the Future, because I think that it is essential that the future should be a priority for us, and we should get ready for the future that awaits us, full of challenges. Well, I'm going to talk about one of the main risks that the democracy will just fail to manage all of the other risks. In other words, we need a policy that can help us resolve all of these challenges. So there is a necessary interaction between democracy, uncertainty, and risk, which will serve as an inspiration not of the content of my presentation, but rather on the structure of my presentation. The health of democracy has a direct impact on our capability to manage the risks. So maybe we have overemphasized the crisis of democracy concept. So I would like to raise one first point. Are we really in a crisis? Are we in a process of transformation? Or are we in a Zeitenwende? To quote Scholz, this was chosen the word of the year in Germany for very good reason. Zeitenwende in German means that time is taking a turn. In other words, we have been strayed from the path that we had to follow, that we needed to follow to face the future challenges. But before trying to explain this item Bende, these, I would like to say a few words about the crisis of democracy. Democracy has practically always been in crisis because modern democracy, the democracy that we live in, is a product of modern democracy that is subject to permanent process of change. So there are cyclical crises, and it's only natural and perfectly normal in a democracy. There are some underlying crises that sometimes they just break out, they just surface without any prior warning. But apart from these continuous crises, there are what we could call existential crises, which endanger truly the institutions, the democratic institutions themselves. This was the case between the First and the Second World Wars. This is what we could call the Weimar syndrome, which is the only possible explanation for what's going on today. But the context is so different today that we cannot really draw many conclusions. That would really indicate that we are just going back to Weimar, as we can read in the papers sometimes. But there has been a certain deviation from the narrative according to which we could devise our future. It's just like we have gone through a change in the tempo of history. We thought that rebuilding frontiers in Europe was no longer an issue. But look at Ukraine. And there are other convictions which have been abandoned, such as, for instance, thinking that trade and the new interdependencies created by globalization would ensure peace and mutual trust among different government agents. This was the card that Merkel played in her relationships, or German relationships, with Russia. And I think we really have to draw a huge question mark. Montesquieu said that trade is an essential requirement to achieve peace among nations. Kant said that democratization also contributes to peace. Apparently, democratization process is not following the path that we had designed in the 90s, and we expect trade to follow the same path. There was another element of distortion, the disputes over the world hegemony between the US and China. So let's talk geopolitics once again. We do not only have to rebuild our model to face the current situation, but also to be able to bring that into the future. And as a result of the events in Ukraine, we are fully aware that democracies can only prevail through union. But when we talk about the union of democracies, it means that each and every one of the democracies should come to an agreement about what really brings them together, the principles and values that underpin democracy. And this is not quite a fact yet. Democracies have to face not only internal but also external threats, and it's now been defensive. Democracies were on the offense after 89, when it expanded through many countries, whereas now it is on the defensive. There is a democratic recession process. There is a greater number of countries that are evolving from democratic to authoritarian systems, and not the other way around. Having said that, democracy is subject to a number of threats, but democracy has no alternative, at least within our civilization, if you see what I mean. Well, Fukuyama apparently failed when he predicted the end of history, but what Fukuyama was really trying to say is that liberal democracy had no rivals. There was no political idea at the time that had the capacity to compete and replace democracy. So democracy is not facing an intellectual threat, maybe a military threat, but not an intellectual threat. Having said that, I am not saying that there are no other systems which can be used as a reference for other countries, especially developing countries, such as the Chinese development-focused authoritarianism, which is some sort of an authoritarian technocracy, as someone described it. The fact that China could be used as a reference or a model for developing countries is something that we cannot ignore. But that's not a model that we can embrace. The problems of democracy must be resolved within the model of democracy that we know, that we are familiar with, liberal democracy. But the problem today is that there is an imbalance among the different, the two dimensions of this concept, liberalism and democracy. Liberal democracy is like a two-headed creature, one more democratic and republican, and the other head has to do with the institutions, the rule of law, and the liberal and the contents of liberalism. The problem that we face today is that these two dimensions of the liberal democracy seem to separate from each other, and they are starting to not cooperate as they have done in the past. Liberalism is considered to be increasingly less democratic, that is from a neoliberal perspective, and democracy is considered to be less liberal these days. In other words, this split between the liberalism and the democracy is creating some sort of a schizophrenia in a formerly perfectly healthy mind. But the loss of liberalism is occurring in the name of democracy, and that's one of the strategies of populism. The power has been taken from the people, and the people must recover the power. This is a slogan that we hear over and over again when we attend rallies of some political parties. And the problem, by the way, is that the right, the power, is increasingly migrating towards spaces which are not under the sovereign control of the states, but not only the states, but also under the control of the people. So populism is really hitting the nail. Is just saying, watch out, we have a problem with democracy, because democracy is becoming an increasingly formal form of government who pays attention to powers over which it has no effective control anymore. This could apply to the markets or to the supranational integration processes, how the national governments delegate their powers to supranational entities, which are far harder to subject to democratic control. And that is one of the side effects of globalization. The discomfort that is felt these days, it refers to discomfort about democracy and liberalism. I am concerned about these states of affairs, which has resulted in the loss of some fundamental values which make up the liberal democracy. This is, in my opinion, what is being threatened. Well, some say the danger for democracy is liberalism itself. In other words, those who are against liberal democracy point the finger at liberalism, not at democracy. When we talk about liberalism, it's a way of referring to populism. Liberalism is, the strategy of populism is to do away with the military and the autonomy of the judiciary, the division of powers, and the autonomy of the free press, the mass media, the free media. One of the basic characteristics of populism is the fact that they are very unhappy with pluralism, and they have very intolerant attitudes. So this really undermines one of the basic pillars of liberalism. In my opinion, I think we really need to highlight some of the causes behind the success of populist parties. In many countries, they won the elections. That would be the case of Donald Trump, and in many other countries, they nearly won the elections. So we have found new forces emerge, which are quite complex. New cultural divisions between the cities and the countries, traditional versus progressist values, generational differences, which have different political preferences and inclinations. Access to the internet has also brought about a loss of control of the elites over the information, which is really giving rise to the appearance of these two different universes that I've referred to. The prevalence, the preeminence of the sense of belonging and the identity above merely economic interests. I think we have the paradigm of recognition has joined the classical paradigm of the redistribution. But this is upsetting the balance that democratic systems had achieved or established in order to control the divides that occurred in capitalist societies. So we have economic reasons, globalization, complexity, inequality. Then we have the aftermath of the economic crisis, whose effects are still felt very strongly. Those who are the key actors in these protests are the losers of this process, the marginalized sectors of society, those who are known as the left behinds, the people who have been abandoned, left behind, so which has led to people to refer not to the working class anymore, but rather to the left behinds. In other words, those who have really felt the consequences of the liberal systems. But there's also a political component as well. The poor functioning of the democratic institutions themselves. There is a crisis of representation. The political parties are increasingly seen as cartels, and they are not politically accountable. That is the case of some institutions such as banks or even constitutional or the courts of justice. And there's also difficulty to understand what's behind political disputes, because people just are not educated enough to understand these political disputes. And there is an increasing disconnect between increased complexity. Uh, I've talked about technocracies because government is a very complex entity, and at the same time, a political debate in the public space is increasingly oversimplified. What prevails in the public space is just political slogans and very simplistic views of things. And people think that we're just no longer capable of understanding each other. We don't have a common ground for a public debate, and the mass media emphasize the polarization or bipartisanism. This is accompanied by politics as a show, the social media, political discourses which are pure demagogical, and the polarization of political views. These are factors which have to do with the politics or with the very functioning of the political system. And then we have, last but not least, a very obscure actor, cultural, psychosocial actors, if you like. People talk about the malaise of contemporary society. This is quite similar to the Freudian concept of the malaise in culture. Yesterday, I was reading the US newspapers about the result of the concerns of the US youth and the malaise that they suffer, which had not been undetected until now. And this is something that has been perceived for quite some time. And one of the possible explanations is that it has a lot to do with social media, this narcissistic exhibitionism that imposes rules on how you should dress, what should be your look, what does it mean to be a winner. And that is very typical of the US society, to split society into winners and losers. Those who fail in becoming winners, well, they fall into depression, consumption of antidepressants is growing, and so on. So there is dissatisfaction, there is frustration, there are hard feelings. The losers really resent the winners, and there's also a generational shock in which baby boomers are quite satisfied and happy with their lives. By the way, this is the generation that turned out to be the winners in the last decades, versus the millennials, who have a much more precarious situation, not only in terms of work, but also in their personal lives. So this emotional state in representative democracy reflects the existence of a disturbance in the relations between the citizens and the political leaders. Apparently, people think that the political system is incapable of providing answers especially for the economically disadvantaged or culturally marginalized. And this is where the populist response emerges. And dissatisfied voters find in these populist parties their representatives of this disaffection towards political system. The changes in government between the government and the opposition and then back and forth again does not really change the situation. And populist parties are sometimes seen as the only alternative to the old bipartisan system. The problem is that a lot of people feel aggravated for different reasons. And it's impossible to please everyone. You can please some, but not all. So the clinical condition of democracy and its crisis is there is a host of systemic, cultural, political, technological, geopolitical reasons. All of them interconnected, but there is no such thing as a single cause. And all of these factors are interrelated, and it's very difficult to say it's the economy, it's the culture, it's the poor functioning of democratic systems, because all of these are interconnected. Well, this is a brief overview of the current situation, and I would like to move on, having said that, to the next question. What about liberalism? Those who challenge liberalism, well, we consider them to be non-liberal. So when we talk, there's so much talk about non-liberalism. Well, this implicitly points at the lack of alternatives that I've mentioned before, because liberalism used to be opposed to socialism or Marxism or conservatism or nationalism or whatever you want, but not anymore, since liberalism embodies a substantial part of our concept of democracy. Whenever there's a problem with democracy, people point the finger at the perceived culprit, liberalism. So there is a dissatisfaction about liberalism. Populism is not the problem. Populism is just a symptom that something is not working well. And populist parties are the only ones who are capable today of channeling this dissatisfaction. We must take a look at the root causes of populism, not populism itself. Because if we can satisfy people's demands, the power of populism will diminish for obvious reasons. Maybe we should ask ourselves a couple of questions. First, is there any defect in the very concept of liberalism that makes it impossible for liberalism to pass the test of time? In other words, has liberalism become obsolete, out of date, and requires some sort of a renovation or refurbishing? And on the other hand, we need to define whether liberalism is opposed to an alternative ideology under some very vague and not very well defined ideologies whose common aspect is the dissatisfaction about the ideology. Fukuyama himself, a self-proclaimed liberal, has written a recent book called Liberalism and Dissatisfied with Liberalism. And he admits that liberalism is under attacks from the left and from the right due to the fact that liberalism has abandoned, has given up its links with their communities, the national communities, and that it has betrayed the national community and has replaced this community by a very cold global cosmopolitanism that our liberal institutions and elites are so concerned about the world, are equally concerned about their own country as they are about the rest of the world. So there has been a disengagement with the target community of liberalism. I don't know whether these terms are made up by theoreticians or journalists. Sometimes journalists are really much better at detecting what's going on than us. This is known as oikophobia, contrary to xenophobia. In other words, oikos comes from the Greek house. In other words, people just reject sectors of their own community, just like a xenophobe rejects those who does not belong to their community, in other words, foreigners. So this is what Guttard referred to as the anywheres, those who feel at home everywhere, those who can find a job no matter where because they are qualified. They are the representatives of liberalism today. And if we protest against liberalism, is because liberalism has broken this link that it used to have in the national community, but also because liberalism has brought on board the values of the progressive cultural space, the public space, the mass media, the academia. This is the morality of the elites, progressist morality, and therefore the left wing. And there is a component of identity, and the identity left-wing policy just feeds on the resentment of the values of the right as opposed to these new values. And that was a very good strategy for Donald Trump, who used this identity-based discourse of the left to present the white majority as just another identity group. And since the identity discourse of the US left identity is linked to aggravation, Trump said, well, we're an identity group and we are aggravated due to the policies that have been put in place in our country, which prevent us from enjoying the country as we have always done. And that was one of the keys behind Donald Trump's success, because the fact that the white majority was considered as yet one more minority, and they were considered to be affronted. Well, liberalism apparently is based on a universal principle, the equality of the moral dignity of all human beings. But this is not the case at the end of the day. And that is the criticism that has always been made of liberalism. The liberalism is too condescending of inequality and insolidarity. But it is portrayed in such a way that it has brought about a huge intolerance towards positions that do not agree with their values as a result of the demand to the governments, to the states, to impose these progressive values. In other words, the state does not only have to see to a better redistribution of wealth, but it also has to translate part of their doctrine, as we see Spain, the attitude towards LGBTI, attitude towards racism, women, etc., because they consider that this is the true correct moral position. So they just want the moral attitudes of the right not to find a space in the public domain. So both ends of the political spectrum are just aiming their guns, as it were, to the same target, liberalism, undermining very profoundly the principle of tolerance. But this criticism has clearly non-liberal consequences. In other words, both the left and the right consider that society is not made up of individuals, but people grouped together by ethnicity or sexual orientation. In other words, there is a tendency to emphasize groups and not individuals. And this is a clear deviation from the liberal tradition. What does Fukuyama have to say about all this? Well, Fukuyama points out that two culprits. On the one hand, neoliberalism, in other words, radical economic liberalism, Hayek and others, which has really caused all of these unprecedented inequalities in countries like the US, the relinquishment of social policies, etc. On the one hand. On the other hand, postmodernism. The French are to blame. First, the Frankfurtians, those of the Frankfurt School, with their criticism of capitalism, culturalist criticism of capitalism, but Foucault and many others have, at the end of the day, inspired this woke left that is causing so many headaches to the US establishment. And I would like to criticize Fukuyama. I don't think regardless of our sympathies towards the woke left, you cannot consider that liberalism cannot be placed at the same levels of theories or seminars taught by a certain philosophical school, but it served as an inspiration to many movements who are much more powerful than the theory itself, because they have a great social power. They have gone from theory to practice, such as feminism, for instance. Feminism, or some relevant sectors of feminism, have been infected, if you like, with this theory, and have just created this wokeism. How should we interpret now I'm moving on to more delicate grounds. But let me start this part of my presentation with one question. Is liberalism an empty shell, or has the original liberal ideology become an empty shell? Because at the end of the day, when we talk about liberalism, we just think it's just a matter of constitutional government and the institutions of the rule of law. So our institutions have produced some basic contents of the liberal tradition, such as the basic principles such as the free coexistence of free and equal individuals under a legal system that respects their moral dignity and their autonomy and tolerates their pluralism. In other words, in increasingly complex societies where there is an increasing variety of ways of living, liberalism has become some sort of a referee, of an arbiter of this pluralism and diversity through the law and the different institutions of the rule of law. But, and this is something I quoted here when we talk about the crisis of the West. By the way, it's a conservative, Catholic journalist, Rose Dodat, who writes at the New York Times, for the New York Times, and he said in one article that I read and found very interesting, he said the following: liberalism has just produced the shell in which where we live, where politics lives, but it's a shell without any life behind it. Liberalism has lost its stance to become pluralistic moral system as a result of the different liberal traditions, and has become a structure whose only function is practically controlling the power. And this is perfectly legal and embrace pluralism. So liberalism in this maybe in the different representatives of the liberal traditions may not agree. In his opinion, liberalism has always needed something more. If liberalism wants to have a meaning and a purpose and energy, it needs a little bit extra or a plus. This is what he calls liberalism plus. So he says, well, 19th century liberalism is liberalism plus nationalism. So the shell holds all of the nationalist emotions. In the US, liberalism was included Protestantism. After the 60s, or since the 60s, the plus of this liberalism is what he calls the therapeutic spirituality. Well, that was typical of the 70s, you know, Jesus loves you. Of course, he's a Catholic and he criticizes this spiritualism, which is business oriented, very much connected to the hippie movement, which nonetheless provided some life to this empty shell of liberalism. In the case of Scandinavia, this was sustained thanks to the ethnic homogeneity that really helped its solidarity policies. The progressism of social left, of the cultural movement in the US would be the plus in this case. But where is the plus today? In other words, what is underpinning liberalism these days? And, well, he is a conservative, refers to conservative liberalism, but it's also, this criticism is also applies to the new neoliberalism. Unless the liberalism is fills itself with something solid, it becomes the realm of atomized, consumer oriented, and unhappy citizens, which are characterized by a purely materialistic gratification, a society which is keen of obtaining status, but rarely it gets what it wants. So liberalism, as an empty shell, is dissolved into a liquid society. In other words, it ends up losing its support. That's why many of the criticism of liberalism, especially from new populist conservative parties, not only in the US but also in Europe, claim that democracies cannot survive, cannot function. They need a basic majority culture, what the Germans refer to as the Leibkultur. Even though Germany considers itself to be a multicultural society, but well, apparently this support that underpin the system is increasingly lost, and we need this majority support, of course. Here, this is a result of the influence of the migratory movements and the loss of the sense of community. People used to know everyone in their own villages, and now people feel they don't know anyone living in their own building, and they feel really removed from the rest of the community. And we find that the same approach in the liberal right a la Macron. Liberalism is a danger because the Republican the Republicans talk about citizens, not groups, and multiculturalism creates different parallel societies within our own country, and this can lead to the loss of cohesion. And this is something that we need to bear in mind, because what brings us together, it's our principles. This is what Habermas himself would say. So we need, and this is the problem, the exchanging the identity by principles, or replacing principles by an identity. Let me be clear. The problem with liberalism is that it lacks a sense of community and it lacks identity. it's very lightweight in its weight.
por seguir con esa distinción entre leggerezza e pesantezza que cita lo Calvino, ¿no? Que es esa ligereza le permite ampliar ilimitadamente el campo.
So the lightweight
Pero
allows it to extend its scope of action, but it limits it. It makes it close.
a mayor variedad, digamos, de experiencias vitales,
It can
pero tiene por lo menos la ventaja de que nos
help us
arraiga. Y así
to have more vital experiences, but it gives us roots. In the past, we needed religion, nationalistic patriotism, sense of community, or ethnic brotherhood, etc. So, the problem of liberalism,
de los románticos se le hace esta crítica.
and this is nothing new, this was a criticism of liberalism since the time of the Romantic movement.
El problema con el liberalismo
So the problem with liberalism is the lack of communities, the lack of ethics. So what do liberals have to say about that?
con esa liberal es que
Well, they say, well, that's just fine, but
sí, quizá debemos ir a todo esto, pero el
But
problema no es
the
la
problem is not
identidad en sí misma, sino
the
cuando
identity itself, but when the identity becomes tribalism. In other words, when we move from communitarism to tribalism.
O sea, cuando no nos desviamos de las opiniones de
In other words, when we stick to the opinions and the views of our own group,
cuando la forma en la que interpretamos
when
el
the
mundo,
way
que se llama epistemología
we
tribal,
interpret the world
la que
is
predomina. Es decir, que
a
nos
tribal view,
creemos
and that is the prevailing view.
coincidir con aquellas descripciones del mundo que coinciden
And we tend to agree with those worldviews that belong to the group I belong to, when the criterion
está mal,
based upon I judge whether it's something right or
si es
wrong
bueno, si es malo para mi grupo.
is whether it is
Es decir, cuando se abandona
good or bad for my tribe. In other words, when we give up
acaba diluyéndose
on the idea of the autonomous individual, the individual is diluted into the very group that he or she belongs to.
seguimos con la idea del
Okay, we are still using here the image of the empty shell.
pero por
but
parte de otros
Others
también digamos hay una preocupación
are concerned about the inability of liberalism to bring society together, but not for reasons of identity,
cuestiones de
but for reasons of solidarity and equality.
es decir que es necesaria para una mayor
In other words, for a greater social cohesion, we need
o sea, igualdad,
equality,
igualdad económica,
economic
sistemas
equality
de recompensas que sean
linked to equitable reward system.
el tema de la meritocracia pues está poniendo en cuestión, ¿no? Hay un nuevo
There
debate
is currently a new debate on meritocracy. I don't want to go into that now because we will hold a session specifically devoted to liberty, equality, how they can be matched and balanced together. But
acusar al neoliberalismo,
this, as I was saying,
pero no la
was
tradición liberal como un todo. El propio
was used to blame liberalism. Ralph Davenport, one of the great contemporary liberals,
un sociólogo muy
a very prestigious sociologist, gave up his German citizenship and became a UK citizen,
pero bueno, es una de las personas que más insiste en dos cosas, ¿no?
emphasizes two ideas.
Progreso de la sociedad,
Conflict is basic for the progress of society.
la sociedad,
He thinks that societies move forward
pero por otra parte que es
through
una sociedad
conflict,
solo
And he also claims that society can only operate
life
uh,
chances, es decir, de oportunidades.
so- uh,
Es decir, que una sociedad sin igualdad de oportunidades al
through
final es una
what he
sociedad,
refers to as life chances. A society without
sociedad,
life
una
chances,
sociedad
it's an
injusta. Bueno,
unjust
dentro de la tradición democrática
society.
también
John
John
Rawls
Rawls, en Estados Unidos
in the
es
US
considerado un
is
socialista
considered a
radical.
radical socialist,
O sea que,
and he's a
y es
liberal.
liberal. O sea que la
So the
tradición
liberal
liberal
tradition,
da mucho juego, es decir, que en ese cascarón
well,
aparentemente vacío,
is quite rich in this empty shell.
no solamente
There are people who are not only concerned
en
about
los que está insistiendo mucho una nueva literatura filosófica que es crítica,
the distribution of wealth, but
como puede ser, digamos, la política del
the
reconocimiento, que es algo que se
policy
propone
of
sobre todo por parte de los
recognition
comunitaristas. Y aquí es donde nos encontramos
as well.
por
This
ejemplo,
would be the case
ese imperativo, ¿no? que
of
la teoría
of the
Rawlsiana
Rawlsian theory
digamos, por la
that
necesidad de garantizar un igual autorrespeto.
claims that
De que
people
mirarse a los
need
ojos,
to
de que nadie
respect themselves so that people can look each other in the eye. Society is not just if there are some
también el liberalismo, como también el
sectors of
secularismo,
society who feel
como decir,
humiliated. That is
de la propia Judith.
uh,
Bueno, yo creo que esto se
uh,
complica,
the essence of
bueno, voy a abandonar este
liberalism.
debate. Ustedes saben, merece algo más extenso, que es lo que haremos aquí dentro de algunas semanas, pero digamos
Of
aquí
course,
lo
we'll
que
be discussing this issue further
preocupa de este debate no
in
es
other conferences within this cycle.
algunos debates teóricos son muy entretenidos,
But
yo creo que se
the debate
la cuestión
becomes
de las emociones.
more complicated
O sea,
still
una de
when
las
we introduce
acusaciones que se hace al
the concept of emotions.
liberalismo
Liberalism
frío, como
is criticized, among other things, for being
vive de espaldas
cold,
a
for living,
espaldas a los afectos,
turning the
hablamos
backs
de
to emotion and affection.
liberal que desatiende de ellos. Aprovecho para decir que este
By
es
the
uno de
way,
los temas
this
en
is
los
one
que
of
se
the
está metiendo más
topics that is increasingly discussed in political theory these days, to reclaim the emotional component of politics that explain many different
que está ahora considerada
behaviors that
prestigiada dentro de nuestro área de conocimiento.
were considered as purely
Esto es uno de los
emotional in the past, and of course
quienes
this is one of the favorite topics of those who defend the identitary policies,
apartados del grupo mayoritario
because many feel
en la que el grupo mayoritario
apart from the majority is
determinadas
precisely because the way
del tipo.
the majority
Bien, primer punto, yo creo que es radicalmente
takes a position
que el
with regard to these issues. Well, I think this is absolutely false. Liberalism has always dealt with emotions. Hume, Montesquieu, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mills, Judith Clark.
digamos,
Emotions have always been
liberales que
a
tenemos
concern for the liberals.
económica del liberalismo.
So liberalism has not only focused on economy, but we have to be extremely cautious when we deal with emotions. Emotions are one thing, and emotionalization is a different thing. Feeling an emotion is one thing, but
producción de una determinada
promoting the
emocionalidad para conseguir
production of a certain emotionality to pursue political
es decir, incentivar
goals
al odio,
is a different thing. And this
extender
is what populists do, to encourage hatred,
terroríficas,
to instill
fomentar
fear, to encourage
o sea que es una política
resentment. So it's
emocional,
an emotional policy,
sí, es una política emocional
not
no porque
because
eh, digamos, el liberalismo haya dejado de
liberalism
lado
had
las
just
emociones o el resto,
given up on
sino sencillamente
emotions,
porque hay una
but because
voy muy
emotionality
rápidamente, voy a acabar
is becoming
con
increasingly
esto a mí lo que me preocupa
instrumentalized.
de la
So what I'm
emocionalización
really
y de
concerned
y
about
sobre todo cuando se asocia
this,
a la cuestión de las identidades,
especially when it
es
deals
que
with when it's connected to
las emociones son
identities,
proposiciones
is that emotions
irrefutables,
are
¿no?
irrefutable
Que se declaran como auténticas en sí
statements.
mismas, o lo que es lo
They
mismo, a los sentimientos
they
no se les
declare
puede
as
refutar,
themselves
se les puede negar,
self-evident.
pero no.
You can hurt
Todo
feelings,
lo que
but you
se
cannot
presenta
refute feelings.
como,
And anything that looks
porque cuando alguien
like
empieza
a
a argumentar,
refutation
al
of
final
emotions,
se interpreta como una.
this is interpreted
Ustedes sabrán que
as an attack.
siguiendo las directrices de la cultura de la cancelación y de la cultura woke en
Following the
general,
guidelines of the
en los
cancel
Estados
culture and the
Unidos
woke culture,
no se puede hablar en
in
muchas
many
universidades de Palestina,
U.S.
de Israel,
Universities,
porque puede herir la sensibilidad de los judíos o puede
there
herir la
can be no
sensibilidad
discussion about Palestine because they don't hurt the feelings
que por tanto además está
of the Jews or the Muslims.
la libertad de
So
expresión en
freedom
lugares donde la
of
libertad de
speech
expresión es absolutamente
is being
prescindible para la propia
curtailed and
comunicación.
limited
Es decir, si no, no
in
hay universidad.
institutions
Y esto
where
sí que
freedom
luego
of speech
tiene
is
consecuencias
absolutely
más
quintessential.
evidentes.
The
Entonces, bueno, aquí
academia, the universities.
lo que a mí me molesta es que parece que cuanto
Apparently,
más
the
profundamente se
deeper
siente, tanta más
the
razón
emotions,
se tiene.
the more
Esto es
we are in the right. And this is not the case. This is anti-democratic and this is anti-liberal, because what liberalism promotes is that
En último término, de lo que se
at the end
trata,
of the day,
de lo que se trata es de debatir toda cuestión disputada, no tabuizar determinadas cuestiones porque potencialmente
the thing is that
afectar
some questions
determinadas
should
grupos.
not be made taboos
Bueno, lo que quiero
because
decir con,
some
lo
specific
que quiero
groups
decir con
may
bueno, esto además
feel
lo que
offended.
contribuye es precisamente a
And
seguir
this
el
really
lanzamiento de las
contributes
abstenciones. El
to
liberalismo se revela frente al mundo
make
estamental, que
people
era el mundo de las abstenciones.
belong.
Por eso se fija en los individuos. Ya estamos
Liberalism
asistiendo a una crisis del liberalismo donde se
used
vuelve
to
precisamente
focus on the
a una especie de
individual, whereas
neoestamentalización a
nowadays
partir de las culturas,
it
grupos
sort of focuses
identitarios,
on different
a partir
cultures,
de la incorporación
different identity groups,
de estos elementos
and
relativos
the
a los
different elements
la conclusión,
connected to
de que
emotions
será
and
un vacío,
affections. So, in conclusion,
no, todo,
there is no
sentimiento, identidad,
empty shell and not
es
anything that
compatible con el
is
que detrás hay
is a
una
feeling
cultura
or an emotion is not
sustantiva
liberalism.
que
There is a
excluye la
substantial
posibilidad
policy
de
that
poder
excludes the
con
possibility
otras
of
que no.
living with others that do
Y
not
la
share these
característica
tenets. And
fundamental
the
de los sistemas
main
democráticos,
characteristic
por lo
of
que
our
ahora mismo
democratic
a los
systems
sistemas democráticos se les está poniendo
and the main criticism to democratic systems these days is the attempt to define the principles that must make up this new cultural, liberal culture policy between the woke movement and the traditional liberalism. So, is it possible to transfer
sostenimiento de la
the
democracia ahora
essence of liberalism to
pueda acogerse
support and endorse democracies in other cultures.
esa maquinaria,
In other words,
ese
this
caparazón del que
shell
hemos
that
hablado,
I've
puede acoger
mentioned before,
otros,
can it
otras culturas. ¿Hasta qué
embrace
punto
other
es compatible
cultures as
con
well? To what
las culturas
extent is
asiáticas,
this compatible
con
with
el
Asian
Islam?
cultures, with Islam,
Pero este
etc.?
es por ejemplo,
Well,
Putin dice que es
Putin, for
incompatible con,
instance,
es incompatible con la
claims that
cultura
this is
tradicional
not
rusa o
compatible
cristiana en
with the
términos generales, y por esto dar la
traditional
razón a Putin
culture,
muchas personas digamos que vienen de ese. Bueno,
and
realmente
many people agree with that statement. Well,
en lo que no puede caer el liberalismo es en eso
liberalism
que le señaló
cannot,
John Gray, digamos, es el más descreído
in the
respecto de la
words of John
posibilidad
Ray,
de
which
supervivencia
was
del
really
liberalismo.
very skeptical about the possibilities
No estoy de acuerdo.
of survival
Si el
of
liberalismo tiene
liberalism.
un
He says in
futuro,
a quote,
es como
if
terapia
liberalism
frente a la
has a future, it's as a therapy against the darkness. And I do not agree with that statement, by the way. Thank you. Well, we have time for a question, maybe.
Perdón, me he pasado de...
Well, I'm sorry, I've just taken too much time.
Un momento, por favor.
Good evening.
No se le oye.
¿Cuántas de las personas que
How
hemos
many of the people here in this room
a la inauguración de este ciclo, bueno,
are
como yo, tan enriquecidas, sin verlo todo claro, tan enriquecidas como
as enriched
apartados
as I feel myself about the topics that Fernando Vallespín has talked about?
por eso Fernando
I think, Fernando,
Sala si comparte ese interés que no se jubila nunca,
that everyone shares this opinion with me because we are always keen to learn from someone who talks about these topics.
de esta manera.
And that's why we have remained silent and we have not asked any question because we're still trying to process all of the reflections that Fernando has made on the topic.
Yo creo que nos han quedado sentados.
Well, I think everyone is still sitting here just to see how this all ends. But thank you for your words anyway. Well, thank you for this conference. That was really very enlightening. I have a question. This is not really my question, but I took it from a Chilean philosopher, Cristóbal Beloque, who discussed liberalism and cartography and mapping. And he used an example referring to climate change. He said the idea of liberalism is like a great party. The people in the party are really having a great time. But there are people waiting outside. And the good thing about liberalism is equal opportunities, the chance for the people waiting outside in line to access the party. In other words, the market, wealth, etc. But if everyone comes in, the house collapses. So, if the promise of liberalism is fulfilled, equal opportunities so that everyone can pursue a better life, this would be at the expense of depleting natural resources, etc. So Belolio, this Chilean author, questions the complexity of the solution to climate change. So, do you think that it is possible to resolve this? Because the solution would be to tell those waiting in line to just go home because there's no room for all. Is there a paradox, or is that the position that we need to take with respect to climate change? Well, we are going to hold a session on climate change, and maybe we will have time to discuss that. But I think that our development model must necessarily change transport, energy, etc. But no one said that we cannot just carry on living the life we are living. No one is going to die because they cannot use their private vehicle.
Pero sí me gustaría hacerte observar una cosa, ¿no? Y es que si ahora mismo hay sociedades que tienen
And there are societies today who have really understood that a radical change is necessary in our way of life. And these are the more advanced liberal democratic societies. Maybe because they can afford it, but undoubtedly what you're saying is quite a common belief. But I don't think this is incompatible with liberalism. I think it's incompatible with a vision of justice based on the acquisition of a minimum set of commodities for all. And that, well, maybe we should lower the bar so that there's room for all. I felt some despair when you said that feelings cannot be refuted, they can only be hurt. Can you please elaborate on that? Because you're probably right, but it's quite disheartening. Yes, well, this is quite common when we argue with someone who has strong feelings and emotions. The heart has reasons that the mind doesn't understand, as the saying goes. In other words, you can argue against hatred, but that does not necessarily mean that people will stop hating, especially in people who in which that hatred is very deeply rooted. So that is how emotions work. Just remember, some years ago, this movement
Pero claro, puede haber mucha gente
that
que
they
se
called the outrage, the indignant.
entonces, bueno,
If
la
people feel
indignación
outraged,
en
there
sí
must be a
misma
reason.
es expresiva de que se
But
sufre
this outrage,
o el
does
sentimiento
that
de algo,
really mean that there is an injustice or the
está
sense
siendo,
of affront?
yo creo que,
If you feel affronted, does it necessarily
pero bueno, no
prove
será
that
negativa, porque si una
someone has
persona se siente
affronted you? I think not.
permanentemente,
But
digamos,
emotions
la
are
emocionalidad se pone
always in
para,
play,
digamos, para
and
justificar
emotions are
experiencias
used to justify uh,
cotidianas, ¿no? Y hay
perfectly
muchísimos ejemplos, ¿no? Y tú mismo puedes
reasonable and common political positions, and there are many
hombre,
examples
desde
of
luego
these.
la emocionalidad
Emotions
es uno de tantos síntomas de
are
que
just another
cuando el
symptoms that
odio y
something is
cuando se
going on
expande
when
el odio
hatred or fear
es porque primero puede
become
ser
commonplace.
muy racional,
Maybe it's because
pero uno puede
fear can
encontrar
be
también
a
una
very
explicación,
irrational feeling sometimes, but
pero una vez que el miedo ya está
sometimes
ahí,
there is a
tenemos
reason
las razones ya.
for fear.
No, el miedo
Well,
quizás
maybe
es mal
fear
ejemplo
is not a
porque
good example
el
because
miedo en su
fear,
sentido estricto, es decir, el miedo
fear of
real,
something, not this
que
diffuse
se hablaba
fear
de
that
angustia,
Freud talked
pero el que has
about the
dicho,
anxiety, but
el miedo difuso
this
no desaparece
very
porque el
vague
miedo
fear,
no, el miedo, digamos, frente a
or
algo puede
rather
desaparecer en
fear against something, disappears
el que el
as
pequeño
soon as the
taxista subiendo a la
danger
carretera y viendo una
is
patrulla
has disappeared. If
seguir lo que has
you're
pasado,
afraid
miedo
of
volar,
flying,
que cuando eso
well,
ocurre
the fear
normalmente
disappears
son
once you have landed.
angustias,
The problem is these anxieties, this very
mantenerse
diffuse
en muchas
fear
sociedades
that is present in many societies
estamos en una situación
for quite some time, because I think we are living in a situation of a very diffuse fear of the future. We don't know what the future has in store for us, and this is not easy to fight reasonably,
Las preguntas en la red.
to fight against reasonably. Well, thank you, Fernando. You've touched on a number of different issues. We have no questions from the social media. But I would like to ask a question myself. This social covenant that is based on liberal democracy and the market has been very healthy in Western societies. However, recent events such as the coronavirus, the Ukraine war, seem to point out the need of other forms of solidarity which make up for the sacrifices that the citizens are being demanded. César Rendoyle, sociologist, said that after the Second World War, many countries imposed very high taxes, not for economic reasons, but rather for political reasons, to keep society cohesion and keep the democracy healthy. So the question is, do you think that we are living in a time where the only thing that can fill in this empty shell is the defense of solidarity?
Sí, bueno, eso
Well,
coincide con lo que tú suscitas, coincide con lo que es mi
that is
opinión.
also my personal
Hay
view.
mucha gente
A lot
que
of people
prioriza,
prioritize
bueno, la
religion
religión,
or
prioriza eh, algún otro
some
tipo de
other
identidad, o sea, distintas,
identity
digamos, de la prioridad, digamos,
that
del
is
valor de la solidaridad.
different from the value of solidarity in itself.
Es que sacaras
I found it interesting that you've
eso de lo que decía Rendueles,
mentioned
sacaras el tema de la solidaridad.
solidarity during the post-war,
Tiene que ver
because
con la guerra.
this has really to do,
Vamos a ver,
it has to do with the war.
democracia se expandió
Democracy
en Grecia, es decir, existe.
was born in Greece through a number of reforms
Pues,
that were
guerras contra
implemented after the wars with the Persians.
tiene la
It's a way for the police
a quienes
to
han dado su
reward
sangre,
those who have shed their blood
les
in the
incorpora,
defense of the police. So they bring them on board
mientras
onto the
bombardeaban
decision-making process.
Londres,
While the Luftwaffe was bombing London during World War II,
llamó a
Churchill called Pepperidge to commission the creation of the National Health Service in the UK, because the British working classes were dying
a pie, estaban muriendo ahí en las trincheras, ¿no? Entonces,
in the trenches.
creo que ahí hay un
So
componente que muchas veces
I think that sometimes we lose sight of the fact that the inclination towards solidarity has a community basis.
es que bueno, uno estaría dispuesto realmente a desprenderse
So,
de una elevada cantidad de dinero si
in principle,
fuera para
one would be willing to part with a certain amount of money if the money went to my people. So solidarity is not universal. It is influenced by some sort of link, connection between
Le Pen.
the
Le Pen es meter en
two sides. So Le Pen
de solidaridad del Estado
said,
francés diciendo, bueno, pero
this goes to the immigrants.
decir, esto no
This is not solidary
con los
to the
franceses
French
pasan,
people who are
pasan penuria,
struggling.
cual apela a esa
So
idea
he
de,
appeals
bueno,
to
no me
the
importa-
idea
no me importa pagar
that,
más
well,
impuestos
I don't mind paying more taxes
que van.
as long as these are solidary taxes for my people.
El presidente
Eisenhower
tenía una progresividad en sus impuestos que creo que llegaba al 90%.
Had a taxation system that was staggered all the way to 90%. And this is also justified by this fact.
Cuando tocamos incluso algo como la solidaridad, volvemos a conectar.
So when we talk about solidarity, we must refer once again to identity. There is no way
Pero bueno,
of getting rid of identity.
bueno,
There's no way to get rid of identity, but I think we should make an effort to love mankind in general, not just our people. And that's all. Thank you. Good evening.